dear colleagues, let me introduce Professor William Boyle, an independent expert and consultant of the READ program. So we have prolonging of this conversation and at that moment. And during 15 years, Professor Boyle was the head of the Center of Researches in the sphere of formative assessment in the University of Manchester. And dear Professor Boyle, you are welcome, and thank you that you find the time to participate in our symposium, and you are welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure, and I'm delighted to have been invited to have the opportunity to take part in your symposium today. The theme of my contribution is about formative teaching, learning, and assessment. A little bit about me to start off with, just to add to the summary that you kindly gave before I came on air. Yes, I was Professor of Education at the University of Manchester and also held the chair for educational assessment. During that time, I founded the first British research centre for formative assessment studies and continued with that until 2014. From then until the current date, I've been working, extending my work globally, evaluating, reviewing and supporting development systems in pedagogy and curriculum development. I think it's, you also said that I'd been working on the various READ projects, and I've been privileged to be part of those, and I've enjoyed working with several countries in the region, including Armenia, Tajikistan, and working with some colleagues from Kyrgyzstan, as well as obviously working with Russian colleagues throughout all of that period. Now, I've got a little slide presentation put together. I'm going to show you that in a little while, but I always like to preface the fact that when I talk about formative assessment, I'm actually talking about pedagogy. And sort of globally, research has come round, international publications and research has come round to the notion that this isn't formative assessment, it's actually formative teaching and learning. Because to have a pedagogical model that tries to impose a judgment model, there's always going to be problems. Certainly since the first British national curriculum was in 1989, so from approximately 1990 to around about 2010, there was a global turnover of curriculum reforms. And in that period, outcomes seemed to dominate. You know the situation, a prevalence of league tables, what we call in the UK exam coaching factories. And my concern was the more I looked at curriculum development, we got the notion of a model of competency-based curriculum. Now, the more I was asked to examine and review curriculum, I mean, recently I have been involved in a curriculum standards review in Tajikistan. And it's not a criticism of the Tajikistan document as it is. It's a global criticism that these competencies so often turn out to be lists of tasks. So to return to my opening remark that curriculum and pedagogy are so important because they are interrelated. Now, you may well have your own view on that. I hope you do, and we can discuss that. So back to the meat of the presentation. I've been working along with READ colleagues and members of what hopefully will be called the Russian Center for Formative Assessment Studies on a 3-module program. Let me just see, for formative teaching and learning. Let's just see if I can get that up. Okay. I'm not sure whether you're seeing that. I've put the Russian slide up. which actually defines the three modules. One of which is sharing definitions about what formative assessment actually is. The second module talks about the formative assessment strategies, and the third module demonstrates and informs about how the classroom teacher can organize formative teaching and learning to be effective across learners. So, as I said at the beginning, the term formative assessment is now globally unpacked and is understood by practitioners who work in a formative pedagogy as formative teaching, learning and assessment. As a reference to that, my co-research colleague, Dr. Marie Charles, and myself produced in 2013 a book which is now globally available. I believe there's a Russian version going to be produced by the end of the year, certainly by 2022, and it's simply called Formative Assessment for Teaching and Learning. And you may find that useful. So the three modules. In module 1, the participants explore and share definitions. And we start off with simple tasks and ideas, such as what is effective teaching. So often the word teaching means so many different things. I was taking part in a Zoom the other day, and somebody said to the group of us, pedagogy, we all know what pedagogy means. And I said, but we don't. We have different meanings and understandings of what pedagogy actually is in practice, in policy, in the literature. You can imagine that immediately brought a bombardment of conversation, which lasted for 25 minutes. It could have gone for 2 hours. So the module 1, sharing definitions, we look at what is effective teaching. We ask, how do we know if learning is taking place? And the word is learning, not scoring being allocated or grading being allocated. How do we know if learning is taking place? There's been a lot of conversation during the closing of some schools for periods during the COVID pandemic. And you hear politicians say, we need to make up for the loss of learning. Yeah, of course, there are socio-economical, political, cultural issues all at stake. But what do they actually mean by learning? Another issue that we discuss in Module 1 is what role does assessment have in the learning process? And of course, again, whether you're working in the primary phase, working in the secondary phase, where you're working in higher education, if you're working in preschool, if you're a policymaker, that word, never mind the role of the word, that word has so many implications. Again, in Module 1, we think about linking assessment with planning for teaching and learning. And we use terms such as adjustment, but what does it mean? Adjustment by who? How? By whom? When do we make those adjustments? So the whole range of issues come in that first module. But the core of that is that formative teaching and learning occurs in all teaching sessions. It enables the teacher and the student to adapt respective actions so that they can achieve effective solutions to learning situations. So again, formative teaching and learning is throughout. It enables the teacher and student to adapt respective actions to achieve effective solutions to learning situations. Formative assessment is a constant analysis by a teacher in dialogue with the student. Constant analysis by a teacher in dialogue with the student. And that is an ongoing, connected, moving process. That is what student learning is. It's not a finite summative. It's a constant moving process. And if the resultant actions to that constant analysis by both the teacher and learning are effective, then the learner has progressed. Learning is taking place. Now, I could have used Vygotsky quotes at this stage, because clearly two of the great initiatives that Vygotsky left as a legacy was that remarkable statement that learning should come from within and not be imposed from without. Now, if that isn't a formative statement, then I don't know what is. In how many classrooms, in how many teaching and learning, supposed teaching and learning situations, have you seen learning imposed from without? As Vygotsky says, this is about self-motivation. People talk about co-construction, they talk about self-regulation, but those two terms can be encapsulated simply within that statement of Vygotsky's. If learning comes from within, you've got self-regulation, you've got co-construction. We don't need to be trying to define and describe differentiation to people if learning is driven from within. And the second legacy, to my mind, of Vygotsky's work is where everybody talks about the zone of proximal development, but what the real legacy of that is scaffolding, a term that is now universally understood and universally misunderstood. That scaffolding simply means the specific supporting and understanding of the learner's location so that you can help him or her to move forward in their learning. As part of our work in Tajikistan over the last 2 years, as part of the READ 2 project, we worked on what we call learning assessments. And this links so perfectly with the Vygotsky notion of scaffolding, zone of proximal development. Yeah, okay, keep the expression, but think about scaffolding. We had a tiering notion within our learning assessments, the confirmatory phase in which the learner is able to confirm that she understands the basics of a learning objective. An exploratory phase where the child demonstrates that they can push their understanding, their internalization further. And a third phase, which we call self-exploratory. And in that phase, the learner becomes totally involved and immersed and moves himself forward on a learning continuum. So much to be thankful for Vygotsky. But I've chosen to use a quote from an American guy called James Popham. And the quote is, pauses for breath, formative assessment is not a test, but a process. That process does not focus on producing a score or a grade, but it focuses on producing a qualitative insight into a learner's understanding. Not a test, but a process, as we said, a continuum, a movement happening all the time. And that process does not focus on producing the score or the grade. Of course, there are byproducts. Nobody's saying there aren't summative byproducts, but that process gives the teacher and the learner qualitative insight into understanding. So, to conclude my very brief descriptions of module 1 of the 3-module program, teachers have to rethink the basis of their pedagogy. It has to be an understanding that the pupil is, not just can be, is an autonomous learner. I emphasize the verb is because if the pupil isn't an autonomous learner, then he or she is not learning. They're merely digesting chunks of material. My sadness about seeing so many competency curriculums misconstructed. So this autonomous learner is involved in sharing the construction of and creation of his or her own learning. And that is the true emphasis of self-regulated learning. So module 1, totally focused on sharing definitions within a group, or if the master's student or the doctoral student picks out something that they want to engage in, they can work on that module on their own. Now, module 2 is about the methods of formative teaching, learning, and assessment. To start with an understanding that assessment is integral with pedagogy. And it leads you, as the experienced researcher who's worked in this field for years, to make a statement such as formative assessment is actually teaching. Formative assessment is teaching because it encapsulates all the essence of teaching and learning within a formative assessment style. So any true form of formative assessment methodology is a multimodal pedagogy, which focuses on the complexity of the learner and the learning situation. And those two key points, learner-centeredness and multimodality, have to be present for effective learning to take place. I would defend that to the hilt. Now, another researcher who's impressed me over the years, we've had Vygotsky, we've had Popham, the Swiss Frenchman Philippe Parano. Now, in my own understanding and development as a researcher, from a teaching practitioner through to researcher over a 40-plus year career, is Parano, just as Vygotsky left a legacy, those two important legacies of learning coming from within and the scaffolding, Parano's research can almost be summed up under the terms deregulation and adjustment. Deregulate. So the roles Parano sees, and his research proves, that the roles of teacher and student, a learner, if you want to use the word learner rather than student, have to be deregulated from the traditional transmission and passive reception model. And what do they have to be deregulated to? The more fluid transactional role. You need to think and reflect on that. So traditional teaching is almost the delivering to a class, delivering the lesson with teacher presentation, task distribution. Assessment very often is a specific event, oral questions, written test, an assignment. In some places, heaven forbid, still the quiz, and then some percentage point or grades, etc., etc., etc. are given out. Well, forget it. Because, quote, Parano, the ensuing retroactive regulation is often restricted to reworking notions which have not been understood by many students. I don't need to tell you that. You know that's exactly what happens. You take part in a delivery model, you get passive reception, and you move on because you think, oh, I've got at least the majority there. How wrong you are. This has to be an involved learner. This retroactive regulation that we see in so many teaching and learning situations usually only takes place at the end of a phase of learning, end of a lesson, sometimes even the end of a project. And it relates to levels of understanding which take precedence over learning processes. So in other words, what grade did I get? What score did I get? What's the pass mark? No, what you're interested in is the learning processes. Have they taken place? And because we are almost conditioned to this summative grading notion, it impedes identification of the all-important cognitive difficulties encountered by pupils during the so-called learning activity, And I say that because how often, if you're a practitioner, you've been in the classroom, if you've been in a lecture hall, you've been in a lecture hall, you've been in a seminar, you've been in a seminar. How often have you looked around the group and thought, is learning taking place here? I'll leave you to answer that yourself. So, formative, multimodal teaching is obviously vital to student learning progress and to learning outcomes that we have no alternative but to find ways of remedying the deficiency. Now that's an Englishman. I've actually introduced an Englishman into our potpourri of references and research. That's Alexander. That was actually written in 2008, so 13 years ago, and it's still pretty tight. Multimodality, the way of opening a lesson to attract children, students of all ages who learn in different ways. Why don't we realize that the drama, voice, painting, sculpture, the whole range of multimodality is going to attract students rather than the pedantic offering of a fixed style, competency-based lesson. So when I talk about formative assessment and I talk about module 2 being all about the methods, and I in this slide now introduce the methods, but I make it quite clear that those methods are integrated. It's not about, oh, let's learn differentiation, let's learn observation, let's learn guided group strategy, and then we go and use them. No, it's about pre-service and in-service development, focusing on learner-centered teaching, multimodal teaching, but using formative strategies such as differentiation, observation, guided group, co-construction, self-regulated learning, true dialogue, which becomes dialogic, reflective planning, analysis, and feedback. If you want to follow those up, the research was originally developed by myself and Dr. Charles way back in 2008. It can be found in print in many things, but I would recommend there's going to be a Russian version of that soon in what's called Formative Assessment for Teaching and Learning. Globally, it's published by Sage Books. The read people will be able to tell you what it's actually going to be published under in its Russian version. So I'm not going to go through all 8 of the methodologies. Obviously, that they're dealt with in detail in the second module, but I will sort of float over a couple of them. Differentiation. Now, differentiation is so crucial, and yet it's so often misunderstood. We see, for example, people saying, oh, I'm using differentiated groups, and I'll come on to group work in a moment. But you think, well, are you? Because differentiation has a simple premise. Students do not have the same abilities. That's a norm, that's a given. It's got to be accepted. Different starting points, different socio backgrounds, different academic capital, different economic capital, different cultural norms, etc., 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 etc. So students do not have the same abilities, nor do they have the same needs, nor do they have the same learning styles. So an optimal learning situation for one student will not be optimal for another student. To prove this, one can write a simple equation. And again, we're back to Parano. And Parano's equation is diversity in students plus appropriate treatment for each student equals diversity in teaching approach. So diversity in students, it's there. Every group of 60, 600, diverse. We're all different. Learning styles, learning background, blah, blah, on. Needs plus appropriate treatment for each. So what do you get? You get differentiation, which Parano sums up as diversity in teaching approach. We'll go back and we'll take another of the pedagogical strategies for formative teaching and learning, and we'll have a look at self-regulation. Now, we hear self-regulation spoken about, written about, but we are talking here about learner-centered teaching, we're talking about multimodality as being key in the delivery in the classroom culture. So self-regulation, and this is a direct quote from the Read book that's shortly to be available. Self-regulation involves interplay between student commitment, student control, and student confidence. 3 factors: student commitment, student control, and student confidence. It directly addresses the way in which students can be trained to self-monitor, self-direct, and regulate their own actions towards a learning goal. It inherently implies autonomy, self-control, self-direction, and self-discipline. Now, if we could bottle that, as we say in England, put a label on it and sell it, you'd have, on the label would say, an effective autonomous learner. Because that is the key to what ministries globally throughout the world look for: effective learning. So that self-regulation from our module 2 pedagogical strategies. Now, one final one. We talk about group work endlessly. You go, doesn't matter which country in the world you go and visit, and you go into 3 or 4 classrooms and you find 4 or 5 different variations of group work. Some do quite well, some where there's patchy learning, and some where there's boredom. But guided group teaching, where you have 4 or 5 maximum for a focused teaching session about a specific learning object related theme. If you haven't tried it, read the book. If you have tried it, I'd be really interested to see how it worked for you. So what does it offer? 5 points to summarize. So a guided group is a strategic organizing management device in a classroom. Why? Because, second point, it's the optimal opportunity for specific and focused teaching. Why? Third point, this small group teaching situation, which is restricted in time, 15-20 minutes maximum, enables learning to be planned tightly. It offers ready access for the learner to the teacher. So the teacher has 4 or 5 maximum children in a guided group on a specific theme. Fourthly, it's a rich opportunity. It's the optimal opportunity for the teacher to focus assessment opportunities within a small group. And because they're a group, final point, those students, those learners become part of the process of collaborative knowledge building. We hear regularly about co-constructing knowledge. Well, how do you do it? You don't do it by thinking, oh, that's what I'm going to do. You do it by planning, and you use guided group teaching as a serious plank in that planning. So I've just plucked 3 for the purposes of this presentation. There are 8 methods, but they don't happen one at a time. They will be integrated within the toolkit of the teacher to develop formative teaching and learning in the classroom. So that's module 2. So module 1 was defining formative teaching, learning, assessment. Module 2 was 8 strategies, the 8 integrated strategies for pedagogical work. Now, the final strategy is a way of exploring how is it effective? Because there's no point saying, okay, I'll give it a go, but I've no idea really what I'm looking for, or is it any different from what I've already done? So module 3, succinctly, how do you recognize effective formative assessment? Well, what I'm going to do here, rather than talk through all the aspects of that module, I'll give you some clues or some thinking points. Okay, so number one, teachers aspire to children voice, student voice, because there's a lot of research in the early O's, 2006, 7, etc., Joanna Boyle, etc., of how little student voice there actually was in the classroom. People went in, sat with their stopwatches and measured the teacher dominating the classroom, and children's voice, rather than saying yes or no, I mean actually contributory voice, was something like 5% of the 95% teacher occupied. So we're talking about what is real dialogue. So we have dialogue in module 2. It explains what dialogue is, not Q&A, etc., and how that dialogue becomes dialogic. Dialogic with a child has moved on to that self-exploratory stage, the autonomous learner, where they are taking part in problem-solving conversations. And yeah, the teacher, the professor, the lecturer, whoever who's part of that contributes, but this is real dialogic. Okay, so what is dialogue? That's one of the things I'm looking for when I walk into a classroom, and I'm seeing, I'm told we do formative teaching and learning in this school, so I want to see what's effective. I'm looking if what I call real dialogue, and in module 2 we explain what real dialogue actually is taking place. Then, what is your understanding of active learning? In some situations that I've been in, active learning is something as basic as children putting their hands up quickly. And this forest of hands that goes up somehow makes the teacher feel confident that the children are active. At the other end of the extreme, I go into a classroom and I can't even tell which one's the teacher, because you've got groups or twos or single students and activities in a range of multimodalities taking place, and that is active learning. And somewhere in the middle of that, we need to get as many of the teaching professional we can, but continuing to move in the direction towards autonomous learning. How do you initiate learner autonomy? How do you move away from the dominance of transmission for almost every minute of a delivered lesson, so that the learner moves beyond the verb involved in learning, but is actually feeling that they are involved and leading the learning? I know how frightening, over years of giving these presentations, if you suddenly say leading the learning and half the room freaks out and thinks, we can't have that. I'm being paid to be the teacher. I'm being paid to be the lecturer. What? Come on. Grow up. This is 2021. What we're actually talking about here are empowered learners with a voice who are much more effective as learners if they are exploring the topic, suggesting the topic, taking the project to the nth degree. Again, module 3 is looking at how effective. So we hear people talk about, or in the literature we see the term nurturing pedagogy. What is a nurturing pedagogy? Well, you'd start off, you walk into a classroom or you walk into a seminar and you immediately know what is not a nurturing pedagogy. You see staleness, you see rigidity, you see formulaic. What you want to see are the learners alive and active and presenting and suggesting, and a complete transaction model taking place. We're looking for that change of the roles between teacher and student that Parano was asking us to look for, the less vocal domination by the teacher, where we've got the more student voice. We're looking for student generation of questions, student generation of research issues, problem solving, problem raising, just the teaching for effective learning. And it was a dreadful model that seemed to grow around about 2005, and it's probably still with us, of pace and coverage and no balance with depth. We've got to get through this because the head of the department says we've got to get through this. We've got to get through this because we've got to get all of those competencies ticked off by the time we get to at the end of grade 4. So for 5 to be done, Come on now. This is about learning, not about racing through things. I'm going to pause for breath there. Just a little word about the Russian Centre for Formative Assessment, which was founded in 2020. I've been privileged to be one of the contributing voices to the establishment of that. Our aim is to promote a deep understanding of formative teaching, learning, assessment, and how effective it can be and what value it brings to improving the lot of learners, for improving the skill and effectiveness of teachers, lecturers, academics, researchers, and hopefully provide the sort of rich information that we would want to be fed to policymakers for change to take place. Final slide, a very cheeky list of some books that myself and my co-researcher have done relatively recently, and I hope that's been useful to you. Thank you so much. More than happy to take a breath, have a little cup of tea, and answer some questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Boyle. Actually, your speaking is so inspiring that I was thinking for a long time that it is an introduction and just didn't pay attention that you are not exposing any slides, really.
Oh, so you didn't see any slides?
Yes. But yeah, I was thinking that that's the introduction. So if you will, of course, we will share. If your pleasure, we will share the slides with the participants.
Oh, good. I do apologize.
Yeah. So so at least if you show the slide with some references, it will be really helpful at the moment. Check. I do not see any questions in our YouTube channel, at least for a moment. But maybe those who are present here in Zoom, and I know that there are some READ project participants. Maybe they have any questions.
So, dear colleagues, if you have any questions, you have the opportunity to ask them.
Yes, the only comments I see that people miss the presentation.
Oh, but so you will have a way of getting the presentation to share, will you?
Yeah, we will share. Actually, I have your presentation, and so we will send it to the colleagues.
Oh, brilliant! Great.
Yes, and we'll put it into the symposium website together with the video. So, and there is the first question. So I see. Does it mean that when you implement the formative assessment, does it mean that we denied summative assessment, or both summative and formative assessment may be combined somehow? And if yes, so what way they should be combined?
Okay, well, one way of dealing with that, we did in a practical experiment in our work in Tajikistan during 2019 and just before the COVID hit us in 2020. We trialed what we called learning assessments that were based on theme-based activities in a classroom, and we had tiered I don't want to call them tasks, but they were learning objective related activities. And children, learners, these were done with primary phase children, grade 1 to 4. We scaled the tasks, the activities at confirmatory level related to the access to the learning objective, exploratory level, in other words, they had shown the teacher that they understood the basic understanding of that step of the learning objective, and they were ready to move on to an exploratory level. In other words, what else can you show me? But then we gave a third phase that was called self-exploratory, and we encouraged the child to take the task to a redefinition of the task. In other words, they would take the task further. What would you do with this was the question that we asked them. Where would you take this activity? So to answer the question about summativeness, you could almost say that the confirmatory phase and the exploratory phase gave you information that you could then use to give us a summative at that point description of the child's understanding. Now, the self-exploratory was taking it off the scale, and it was something that we were experimenting with because we really wanted to be also checking whether the multimodal way in which the tasks were set up had encouraged the children to really move forward with engagement. So your questioner is asking the eternal question: how can I be a good formative teacher, but also have summative grades to satisfy my policymaker? That was as near as we've got. Way back in 1989 in England, when the first national curriculum and its SATs came out, the University of Manchester, my CFAS team, actually did a pilot for the Ministry of Education in England, the DFE, and we piloted a very raw version of confirmatory and exploratory. And it got so near to being used in classrooms, and it would have changed the face of assessment in England. But at that time, we had Mrs. Thatcher in charge of the government. And to her, assessment meant 50 rows of children in a hall, test paper, fill out the test paper, and that was it. And it was taking us back 200 years as regards education, because teachers were then reduced in their professionalism. They were reduced as esteemed figures. Policymakers from then on looked on our teachers as coaches for tests. And it's taken a long time for formativeness to raise its head. Of course, things like the Centre for Formative Assessment and their equivalents in many countries, the Netherlands, Australia, New Zealand, and even my Russian colleagues and my Armenian colleagues that have bravely been experimenting with ideas, because this is all about saying children have got a lot more to offer than filling in a test on a certain day. Good question. Glad it came up.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wide and specific answer. And another question is about, it's quite similar to the one that I just forwarded to you from the YouTube. Is the question about, first it's focused on the university education, formative assessment in university education. And the question is about how can we assess the effectiveness of implementing of formative assessment, and specifically in the university if possible. So if we apply the formative assessment, so how can we measure or assess the effectiveness? Does it work?
It does work, and in fact, the 3-scale process that I outlined earlier that we've been trying with primary grades, strangely, and not strangely, because in fact learners are learners are learners are learners, it is entirely appropriate for that, because in a sense what you're looking for in a university formative system are those learners who are going into the self-exploratory mode, because they're proving to you that they are already on that scale of moving forward. Because what's the definition of a PhD? It's to bring new knowledge and new contribution. So formativeness is almost the very definition of university education. I could be cruel and say that everything else is in a box. And you open the lid on with formativeness.
Yeah, thank you so much for this answer, because as you mentioned in your presentation, that not all the university professors are really ready and happy to implement the formative assessment, because this is not the way that they were taught, and some of them actually are not sharing this the value of formative assessment, and from another hand, it's more interesting, but it's more complicated. You are just doing your duty formal way, so it's just another headache for you. So, but
exactly.
As you just mentioned, that at least this is quite convincing argument for the administration, and it may be used by administration for the staff, that it's actually fits the formative assessment. This is what the university education is about. Maybe in this case we should replace the summative assessment by formative assessment at the university.
Well, I think I've seen examples of certainly in the UK of more universities going down that route now, not thinking that this is a closed off, that summative doesn't have to mean closed off. It means, okay, let's not be frightened to take the lid off and open opportunities, and let's see what the student can actually show us. And your point is well made earlier. There is an unfortunate situation in not just universities, but also in schools, where something comes in that is new and it requires more effort and more thinking, then the teacher, the lecturer, the professor even is more guilty than the student in not wanting to try it. Sometimes we have to criticize our own profession.
Yeah, which is probably some result of formative assessment, actually. Yes, thank you, Bill. And I do not see actually any questions. If maybe somebody in Zoom would like to ask, yes, please show up. Yeah, we don't have any more questions at the moment. So thank you so much, Bill, and we hope that next year we will have an opportunity to invite you in person in Moscow, not just by Zoom. And I value some of our meetings at the conferences organized by World Bank here in Moscow. So, and it was a pleasure to see you. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Igor. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Bye-bye.